Okay, so good morning. Let's go ahead and get started because we have a lot of information to cover today. We are talking about Totally Tomatoes with our Master Gardener volunteer, Arnie Barish. We are really fortunate to have him as he has gardened and grown tomatoes up north in New York and also down here in Florida. So he understands some of the nuance and the differences when it comes to growing tomatoes. And so his advice is really helpful to help people adapt and make that change. My name is Mindy Hannick, and I am the Community and School Garden Coordinator at IFAS Sarasota County Extension Office. I have a really awesome job, and I get to know people like Arnie and ask him questions all the time. So we will go ahead and let's get started, Arnie.
Okay, it's morning here in Florida, so good morning everybody from Florida. Maybe some of you aren't, it's not morning. The motivation for this course is our extension gets a lot of questions in the plant clinic about problems growing tomatoes in Florida, successful growing them in a northern climate, but not successful in Florida. So while some of the focus here is on growing tomatoes here in Southwest Florida, a lot of the things I'm going to cover really do apply anywhere you grow tomatoes. I'm going to turn the first couple of charts over to Mindy. She'll take you through what our extension does, what services it offers, and then we'll go back to the tomatoes. So all yours, Mindy.
Thank you. So a lot of times we'll hear from people, what is extension? And extension is basically an extension of a land-grant university out in your community, available to help provide education and resources to the people that live there. So pretty much all the states have an extension affiliation, and ours is with the University of Florida, Department of Agriculture, and then of course here in Sarasota County. So our goal is essentially to provide education and solutions for your life. So, so really we can educate on a gamut of things. 6 core areas are 4-H youth development, agriculture, gardening, landscaping, natural resources, nutrition and healthy living, and sustainability. And so my work with community and school gardens kind of touches on in a few different categories there, as does Arnie's work. Take it away, Arnie.
Okay, let me just add one more thing about extension. Most of my growing experience in vegetables is in New York, in the Hudson Valley. And in New York, our extension is partnered with Cornell University. Extension is a great place if you have any kind of problems, vegetables, shrubs. So I would encourage people that if you haven't used extension, if you have problems, by all means. This is an outline of what I'd like to cover today. I'm going to start with what I would consider the perfect tomato plant in Florida. It's sort of like a goal. It's certainly my goal in growing a tomato plant. We'll spend some time just going over the basics of the tomato family. That's really important because what type of tomato you choose to grow can have a tremendous impact on how successful you are. And then we'll look at actually what you need to do to grow tomatoes, when to grow them, what to grow, how to grow them, preparing your bed, addition of organic matter, fertilization. We'll talk about mulching and watering, brief section on pests and disease avoidance. And then if you're not planting in an open plot, you can still grow tomatoes in a raised bed, in a pot. There is self-contained growing system. And then I've added this last section on extending the harvest season. It's a very unique vegetable, tomato, and we'll cover a lot of the unique features. But one of the things that you can do at the end of the harvesting season is you can pick all your green tomatoes, and instead of throwing them away, they will ripen. You can ripen them in your home and extend the season for up to a month. Okay, so here's a picture of what I would consider a perfect tomato plant. And hopefully people can see my cursor as I circle this. There's really 2 different types of tomatoes growing here. There's cherry tomatoes and a little bigger tomatoes. But this is from a commercial grower. These are tomatoes that are grown in a greenhouse. And 68% of all tomatoes that are grown in Florida are now grown in greenhouse. There's a lot of advantages. This particular plant, which is actually a demonstration in Epcot, in Disney World, this tomato was 32 feet long. So that gives you an idea what the capability of the plant is in terms of growth. The plant is watered about every 10 minutes. It's all computer controlled. And it will yield 32 times the poundage of tomatoes per acre than conventional tomato growth. And here's a second example. And you notice I crossed out plant and I put tree because this particular plant, and again, this is from the Living with the Land ride in Epcot. If anyone hasn't been there and you do get a chance, the greenhouses there have some fantastic ways of growing vegetables. Here they've decided to grow the tomato plant. There's 2 tomatoes in there, and it's grown as a tree. And to show you the real potential of this plant, they had a previous tomato tree. It was a single plant. It produced 22,000 cherry tomatoes in a single year, and it got into the Guinness Book of Records. So when I see some of these examples, and I've seen these over the years, as a home gardener, I say, well, okay, what can I do to try in a home garden to try to approximate what you've seen in the first 2 pictures? All right, so let's first look at some of the lessons that you could pick up from the 2 pictures from professional growers. The first is that training the tomato plant can really increase the yield. You increase the surface area, the leaf surface area, and the more surface area you have exposed to the sunlight, the more photosynthesis, the more growth. The more growth, the more flowers. By growing them openly and spreading them out, you get higher pollination. Professional growers, their perfect soil really isn't soil, it's soilless. It's artificial. It's usually some combination of peat moss and vermiculite. And you can see from the boxes, just go back in a second to this picture, those tan boxes, that's all they need in terms of the soil to grow the plant. So a tomato plant only needs 1 to 1.5 cubic feet of soil, but you do need a depth of at least 8 to 12 inches because it's a very deep rooter. They use bottom watering, which can be difficult for some homeowners. Continuous fertilization is best. That's usually not practical. Regular fertilization is probably a good second best. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you, my attempt to mimic. And these pictures were taken fairly recently, about a month ago. These are the tomatoes that I have growing in my community garden plot. On the left here, and you see in the top of the picture, the arrow pointing to south, that's really important because that's where the sun comes from, especially in the winter when the angle of the sun is down. So the tomato is naturally going to want to grow toward the sun. In this picture, there are actually 4 tomato plants, one behind the other. They're in stacked vertical cages, and you can see that I've actually turned them so that they're starting to grow horizontal. In the picture on the right, a little better view from the top, you can actually see all the top growth. And at the time this picture was taken, you have about 60 square feet of surface area of leaf that's exposed to that sun. And again, a couple other things on the picture on the left. By doing this horizontal and vertical, you can see there's some broccoli plants growing underneath, and the plants are high enough so the angle of the sun gets in. So again, it's a space saver also. And here's a view from the bottom. There's a lot of work in doing this. You have to, if you really decide to grow tomato plants this way, you can see the wood. There are wires going across to tie the tomatoes. Here's a little closer up view. You can see the green wire there, the wood supports. And this is under, and tomatoes will form under and over on structure like that. Okay, so let me go back to really the basics about the tomato family. It's in a family called Solanaceae, or nightshade. Eggplant and pepper are in the same family. Northern potato, paprika. This is important because any diseases that the tomato gets may show up on eggplant and peppers if they're planted close to the tomato. Its scientific name is Solanum lycopersicum, and there's some variations of the name. And we want to classify the tomato really into three different categories. The first is the size of the plant. That's important depending on how much space you have, how much time you want to spend. And the next couple of slides, we'll go into details of each of these. And then the type and the size of the fruit. That can have a very big effect on the yield. Depends on whether you have disease problems, insect problems. And the last is genetics. You can improve disease resistance and get much higher yield. So the first way we look at it is by size and production period. And you should make sure when you're buying a tomato plant or growing a tomato plant, you selected the variety size that you want. And they come in two different sizes. One is called determinate. It's a compact bushy tomato. Sometimes it's called a patio tomato. It's a very good choice for a small raised bed, a pot, any small container, or anywhere space is limited. If you're a weekend gardener, it's a good choice. It grows only 2 to 3 feet tall and wide. It requires little and no staking. The downside is the fruit production is limited over a 2 to 3 week period. All the fruits pretty much come at once, and then you're done with the tomato plant. By far, the more popular plant size is what we call indeterminate. And even though it's not really a vine in the sense that it grabs onto things, if left on its own, whether you decide to train it or not, it will grow vine-like. It will grow out in all directions. It will spread. And it can grow at least 12 to 16 feet in a home garden if you train it. A lot of people will just plant the tomato plant, put a traditional, I'll show you pictures in a few slides, of a tomato cage, the traditional one. And once it grows over the top, it tends to form an umbrella shape. It just goes over the top and goes out in all directions and eventually collapses. And they need lots of room. When you're buying tomato transplants, or if you grow your own and you're planting them, when they're 8 or 12 inches tall, they're cute and they're small, and you put them a foot apart, but they need a lot more room than that, and you'll end up just with not being able to even get in there and see if you have any ripe fruit. And indeterminate plants really need some kind of staking, because they will collapse from their own weight, especially if you're growing big fruit. The stems will break, and then you end up losing a lot of what you're growing. An indeterminate plant can really produce fruit for as long as 6 months if the conditions are right. Okay, now we look at classifying by fruit size and shape. And this also really can be important for success. And I don't think I'm going to be telling anybody any new information here. If you've ever gone into the supermarket and bought tomatoes, this is what you see on the shelves. The smallest tomato is a cherry and a grape, 1 to 2 inch round or oval. They're good in salads. You don't have to slice them, and they tend to be expensive. The biggest thing about these tomatoes, if you have problems with caterpillars getting into the tomatoes, they don't bother with cherries and grapes. They're just too small for them to feed off. As you work your way up the side, then you get a salad tomato. A Campari is a good example of that. It's a 2 to 3 inch round tomato. It's sweet. It's low acid. If you really want to look into the research on this, there's something called a brick number, which classifies how much sugar is in the tomato. So whether you want a sweet tomato or an acid tasting tomato, that might be a consideration when you're selecting what tomato to grow. Again, going up on the size a little more, we get into the plum tomato, which is a 3 to 4 inch oval. And that's the standard for making tomato sauce, putting on pasta, pizza toppings. And then the standard tomato, which is your traditional slicing tomato, it's 4 to 5 inches round, 6 to 8 ounces typically. It's your typical eating tomato, and you'll find the largest number of varieties if you're ordering seeds, or even if you're going in to any of the nurseries or big box stores. This will be where you'll find most of your varieties. Most of your heirlooms are standard tomatoes. They're open pollinated. I'll define that term a little later. And then the biggest tomato that you can grow or buy is a beefsteak tomato. They tend to be 6 to 9 inches round to semi-lobed, up to 1.5 pounds. Sometimes here in Florida, you'll see them labeled ugly tomatoes because they do form lobes, and sometimes they can be pretty ugly. They taste good, but they don't look that good. They're very good for sauce. There's a lot of meat in them, good in sandwiches. There's a cultivar called Steakhouse. You see the little picture over here on the right of someone holding a big tomato in his hand. I actually grew this for a couple of years, and I had one weigh in at 2 pounds, 4 ounces. The downside of this tomato is normally when you grow full-size tomatoes, they'll form 2 or 3 tomatoes off a branch, and it can only support 1. If you allow 2 to 3 to form, it'll just snap the branch right off. So you almost have to support these tomatoes, but if you like big tomatoes, that would be the variety to grow. Okay, and the last classification is by genetics. And here we're not talking about genetically modifying, no GMOs. This is just what the tomato is, what its gene structure is made up. And plant scientists in the last 5 or 10 years have spent a lot of time looking at the DNA chains of all plants, especially tomatoes, just like in humans, and they find certain genes that may make that variety very resistant to a certain disease, or another gene may produce a large tomato. And you have hundreds of thousands of varieties. So you really want to choose your tomato size, right? That might be important to you. Type, an heirloom would be one type. A taste, you want an acid, a sweet tasting tomato, or disease package. I grow for the last 9 or 10 years, I've been growing in a community garden here in Florida. And for the last 6 or 7 years, I spend my summers in New York. I grow in a community garden in New York where disease is very prevalent. And disease package is very important for my selection of tomatoes. And then there's what we call open pollinated. And what that basically means is the seed that was used to grow your plant has the same parents. Heirlooms are open pollinated. Some don't have the best disease resistant, but basically you can save the seed from an open pollinated plant and it will produce just like the plant you grew and the previous parents. Cross-pollination, again, we're not talking about GMO. We're talking about the growers take the pollen from one plant and deposit it on a different variety. This is done by hand. And they've been doing this for about 70 years. Most people, if you're growing tomatoes, You know the Big Boy, Better Boy, Big Girl, Early Girl series. Big Boy was the first cross-pollinate tomato. It was done in the early 1950s. So they've been around for a while. They have different parents, and they're bred for size or taste, shape, color, and most recently for disease resistance. And it will usually say on the label or in the seed package, if you see an F1, it means first generation, F2, second generation, and the seeds may or may not produce the same fruit you're growing. So keep that in mind if you try to save a seed from a hybrid. Okay, before we go into the actual growing, Mindy, we have any questions that might need answering before we take a later look at the questions?
We have a couple. Can you say, when it comes to your reference of growing like tomatoes like a tree, and I'm pretty sure you're going to show more images about how you go about that. But as far as ease of picking, and anything different? Are you talking ladders, step stools?
I use a step stool only because I want to grow the plants high enough so I can grow something underneath them and still get the sun in. So I let them get about 7 feet tall, and then I gradually turn them. But I really don't need the step stool to pick. It's really to tie them. They continually need to be tied down when they start to grow vertically. I'm sorry, when you start to grow them horizontally, because the natural tendency, of course, is to grow straight up toward the sun. So as they grow up, I have to tie them down, and they grow pretty fast. In perfect conditions, they'll grow 2 to 3 inches a day. So I spend most of my time tying them. Picking them is fairly easy. Those pictures I showed you with the tomatoes underneath, they can be reached. The ones on top, they'll tend to sag low enough where I can still reach them to pick. So picking it doesn't really require, at least the way I grow them. You can grow them higher than that. I'll show you some pictures where I have my plants growing in an earth box, and they're up at 12 and 13 feet, and I got to get out the 8-foot ladder. So it really depends.
So, okay. So, and like you said, we'll have some more imagery and visuals coming forward to talk about that a little bit more. And then someone had mentioned, since you're from New York, they're hoping that you'll include a little bit of information about that. And like you said, a lot of it's going to make sense for people growing in either area. And then you might provide some supplemental information you know, as far as New York, if and when you can, and we can also email them some links and information too.
I have a good chart. I think it's 2 or 3 charts. It'll come up where maybe even the next chart, where I talk about the growing seasons in Florida. And for comparison, I added my part of New York, which is the Hudson Valley, the growing season there, when to plant the tomatoes. So hopefully that should answer the question.
Yeah, I think it's just like 2 slides forward. And then, so we'll do 2 more quick questions and then go back to the slides. One is, if tomatoes from last fall are still growing tall and flowering, should they keep them, or should they be starting fresh with new small plants? They are growing them in a deep pot.
If they're still growing and producing, and they're not pot bound, I think you really want to, it depends how big the pot is. Again, you need that 1 to 1.5 foot cubic feet of soil in there, because they will want to root 8 to 12 inches. As long as there's room in the pot, keep them going. Mine are I plant my tomatoes in early October when I come back from New York, and unless something kills them, I don't pull them down until late April, till I'm ready to go to New York. So keep them growing if they're producing.
Okay. And then someone asked, it's a question I have as well. Earlier, you were talking about different types of tomatoes and acid. Somebody asked, can you give an example of acid tomatoes?
A lot of the beefsteaks tend to be acid. A lot of the slicers tend to be smoother in taste. At least that's been my experience. And then, of course, the smaller tomatoes, they tend to be, especially some of the cherries, there are varieties of cherries that are actually sweet. There's a variety called Sun Gold. It's a yellow cherry. That's about the sweetest tomato that I've ever tasted. So some of them are actually sweet.
Thank you very much. So you're welcome to keep putting questions into the chat, but for courtesy of time for everybody, we're going to go ahead and go back to the slides also because some of the questions that you have, he may be addressing coming up. So take it away, Arnie.
Okay. Growing tomatoes. This is the most common mistake when northern gardeners, including me the first year, come to Florida is out of season planting. The temperature gets very hot here in Florida as we approach the summer. And what that does is the flowers don't get pollinated, so you get little or no fruit. And our winters, even though Florida is great to be and much better than any northern climate, we do get cold weather. This particular winter, we've had some pretty cold weather. We've had at least a half a dozen cold snaps where the temperature's gone into the upper 30s, low 40s, depending on, of course, this depends on what part of Florida you're in. If you're in northern Florida, you could have had a killing frost. If you're in southern Florida, you don't have that problem. So it really depends where you are, but too cold or too hot, basically, you don't get growth, you don't get tomatoes, puts disease pressure on the plant and could kill the plant. So the tip there is, if you're going to plant something in late spring, don't buy that beefsteak. It'll grow probably it'll actually grow through the summer. It'll grow well into early June. You won't really get any tomatoes to speak of. But there are varieties here in Florida. Solar Fire is one. Someone mentioned the Everglades tomato. That grows year-round, almost year-round in Florida. That's a great tomato, but it's a very small tomato. It's a Florida native. And if you like size in your tomatoes, you probably won't like that variety. Cherry tomatoes will actually grow through the summer and produce tomatoes, not as much as in the fall, winter, and spring, but they will grow through the summer and produce. So if you get if you get inspired by this course, you want to go out and buy some tomatoes today. The best suggestion I would make would be to buy an early variety. They'll start producing ripening fruit in 50 to 60 days. We have about 3 months, a little more, maybe three months and a week or two, where you'll have the temperatures right for the tomato to grow and produce and ripen fruit. So end of February here in Central Florida, you would want to grow an early variety, or again, start thinking about the summer varieties if you do want to grow in the summer, or a cherry tomato. Okay, so don't give up. Okay, here's the chart that I alluded to. The first table is really what you would do here in Central Florida. You would adjust this for other regions in Florida. Here where I am, we're in, and you really want to first find out what zone you're in. Just Google, put in your zip code and just planting zone, and it'll come back and tell you what zone you're in. So we're in 9B10A, which means we can get a short freeze, light frost, medium frost. So the best time, we have really 3 seasons here to grow tomatoes. Late summer, early fall. And I'm defining it as a season because you're going to get your best growth in the plant between late summer and early fall. So you really would start your planting in mid-August. You would put a transplant in the ground, and a lot of people are probably scratching their heads and thinking it's too hot. It's too hot for the tomato to produce fruit, but it's not too hot for the tomato to grow. It will do very well in mid-August in terms of growth. And you really would like to complete your planting by mid-September. And the reason for that is we've gotten frosts here, and this is on the Sun Coast, so we're closer to the ocean, by the middle of December. So you could lose your plant by the middle of December. So if you wait till, the middle of October to plant a tomato, you run the risk of the plant being killed by a frost. We don't get them that often, every 2, 3, 4 years. We had very light frost this winter. It didn't affect anything where our community garden is. And then your next shot at planting tomatoes would be early to late spring, okay? And it's actually, you're planting, that's the growing season. You're planting mid-January to mid-February. And planting in mid-January, you're taking a little risk. You may have to cover the plant if you know it's going to be a chance of frost, and it's easier to do when the plant is small. But again, if you start planting later than the middle of February, you just won't get a lot of fruit off the plant. And then, of course, the third season, which most people choose not to grow, would be the summer. And if you're planting the Florida varieties, next month, March to April would be when you would plant the summer varieties. Now, for my area in the Hudson Valley, I'm in zone 6A, 6B. Our last frost date is around May 15th. So you would begin planting mid-May. I actually plant a couple of weeks earlier than that. I get to New York the beginning of May, and my tomato plants go right in. And you would really stop planting by the middle of June, only because first frost in the mid-Hudson Valley is usually around October 15th. So you can see right away it's a lot easier to grow tomatoes in a northern climate. There really is only one planting season, and the more north you go, the shorter the season. So again, if you're in zones 4 or 3, that far north, you really want to be looking at early varieties.
Thanks, Arnie. Can you, so you're going to touch on some of the questions that are being put in the chat on the very next slide. So I'm going to try and keep it brief. But while you're on the chart, we did have a couple questions. When you mentioned this planting timeline, are you talking direct seeding or seed starting, or are you talking about putting a transplant out in wherever you're growing your tomato plant?
Okay, I am talking about an 8 to 12-inch transplant. From seed, and then it'll come up on a later chart, from seed to 8 to 12-inch transplant is about 6 to 8 weeks, depending on your skills in seed starting and growing, and how much attention you're going to give to that transplant you're growing. But if you want to start from seed, you have to back up all of these dates by 6 to 8 weeks.
So if somebody was in like Southwest Florida / Central Florida, and they were looking at this part where it says begin planting, end planting March and April, and they really wanted to try and start some seeds, they should be looking for those summer tomato varieties, the Florida varieties, more of like a cherry, really heat tolerant type of tomato if they're looking to seed start their own and put those out within a tight time frame.
Yes, and if they're in South Florida, where they don't have any frost, they could literally start their tomatoes anytime if they
Okay.
want to start from seed.
Okay. So it just depends on the heat tolerance of and the pollination practice of the tomato that they select for when they anticipate putting it out.
Right, and we'll get to actually the temperatures
On the
in a
next
couple
slide.
of charts. But you really have to factor in temperature to, it's the most important factor in growing tomatoes is the temperature that you have on around you.
Okay, great. And I think you talk about that. Yep, right here. Okay,
Yeah.
so a lot of folks, if you put a question in the chat about pollination and temperatures and things of that nature right now. Thanks, Arnie.
Okay, so first, days to harvest. It might be abbreviated DTH. If you ordered seeds from a seed catalog anytime, you'll find this listed for any variety, any vegetable you grow, any flower you grow, but certainly for tomatoes, it's very important. Now, for most varieties, most tomato varieties, it takes 70 to 80 days. This is from transplant. Most of the seed companies, when some of them tell you, some of them don't, but basically their days to harvest is really from transplant, not from seed. And if you do buy a packet of seeds, there'll be instructions on it to say start at 6 to 8 weeks before last frost or something like that. There are exceptions to that 70 to 80 days. If you remember several charts back, the cherries and the grapes, they will start producing probably, I would say, between 50 and 60 days. It's been my experience. I've been growing a grape tomato for the last 6 or 7 years, and way before that, a different variety, and cherries. They will ripen. They're the first to ripen. So you can knock off 15 days off first fruit by planting a cherry or a grape tomato. And then the big fruited varieties, they do have early varieties. They will tend to produce less fruit, the early varieties, over a shorter period of time. So, a lot of these that were cross-pollinated, they made the trade-off between getting early fruit with longevity of how long the plant continues to make new fruit. And now, ideal growing temperatures. Tomatoes, their perfect temperature is 75 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. They will grow fine when it's warmer. Nighttime temperatures, their preference is 60 to 70 degrees. And those two, the daytime and nighttime temperatures, reflect back on those growing charts, those seasonal times for when to plant that I showed you a few charts earlier. So basically here in Central Florida, that's why the fall season is from the second half of August through the first half of November. From August through the middle to the end of September, it's hotter. The tomato doesn't mind it, it just grows faster, won't produce fruit. But by the time you get to the middle of September, the temperatures are starting to drop, so getting into the upper 80s. And you're starting to get into where fruit production can actually begin. The flowers will actually start to pollinate. And in the absence of a hard frost, a full planted tomato will produce for 6 months. Those pictures of my own plants that I showed you, they went in the ground October 1st. This is the end of February, and they're still going strong. In spring season, it's actually a shorter season. Because you're going into the summer. So second half of February through the end of May, and unless you've planted a cherry or maybe a grape, fruit production is going to stop when you get into June. In season, okay, when you have the ideal temperatures, you can expect 1 to 2 inches of growth per day. I mean, that's really 1 foot to 1.5 feet a week, provided the plant's got good water, nutrients, and minimal disease. Now, here's the key factor. for timing your tomatoes. And again, when I said timing is the most important thing here, for the tomato to make a fruit, for the flower to pollinate, the nighttime temperatures have to be between 50 and 70 degrees. Below 50 and above 70, the pollination rate falls off very rapidly. Florida-bred tomatoes, these are tomatoes that have been bred specifically so the temperature is higher than 70 degrees. They'll continue to fruit above 70, which is why they grow in the summer. Cherry tomatoes and the wild Florida Everglades tomato being an example. And keep in mind that even with global warming, we still get killing frosts. On average, every 2 to 3 years. We haven't had one for probably 3 or 4 years, a killing frost. But I've experienced at least 2 where you come in the morning and I mean, it's really sad when you see it. You know, the plants are dead. Okay, now preparing a bed. Don't neglect your soil. This is the second most common mistake. Soil. I can't emphasize the importance of good soil for growing tomatoes. Now, this is almost like an oxymoron, but we include in good soil, soilless mix, which contains no soil. But whether you grow in soil, a soilless mix, compost, you need a high quality soil for tomatoes. Typical soil, mineral soil, which is not organic, is made up of 3 components: sand, which is what we have here in Southwest Florida; silt, which is that mucky stuff on the side of riverbeds; and clay, which is what I have in my New York garden. And it's classified by particle size. Sand being the biggest particles, silt a little smaller, clay very small. And it has to do with the ability to hold moisture and nutrients. Sand doesn't hold anything. It just leaches right through. So if you try to plant tomatoes in sand, you won't do very well. Silt is a little better. Clay has its own problems. That needs some organic matter to lighten it. And loam, which is what a gardener dreams of, that's the perfect combination of sand, silt, and clay. So tomatoes really prefer a loamy soil that's rich in organic matter. As I mentioned, sandy soils don't hold nutrients. So they're nutrient deficient and they don't retain water. So you need to amend them. Some form of organic material like compost. And all organic material comes from living plants. As I mentioned earlier, true soil is a mineral. It doesn't decompose. And tomatoes will grow fine in soilless mix, which is mostly peat moss and vermiculite, but they need regular fertilization. And you want to check your pH at least once. Here in Southwest Florida, our pHs, at least in central Southwest Florida, near the ocean, they tend to run a little high. And if your pH is above 7, you may need to supplement with micronutrients. If you're reasonably close to an extension office, they will test your soil for pH and salts for a nominal fee. So right here, like in the community garden where I grow my vegetables, it's about 2 miles from the Gulf of Mexico. The soil is all sand, Mayaca River sand. So adding organic compost really is a must. It improves the soil consistency, holds the water. It does contribute some nutrients, may not be enough, both macro and micro, and I'll go into that a little bit. And it supports microbe activity. There's a lot of good bacteria organisms that the plant needs in the soil. So one recommendation, especially if you're a northern gardener coming to Florida, don't till a sandy soil. In the north, tilling is a very common practice. You turn your soil over. You want to leave that sand right where it is. You do not want to bring it to the root area. The best way to grow tomatoes here in a sandy soil is actually to build up a 6 to 8 inch layer of good soil, compost, organic material on top of the sand. Just remember, you only need 1 to 1.5 cubic feet of soil. So if you're planting in an open plot, 4 tomato plants will only take about 10 square feet. Dig it out to a depth of 8 to 10 inches, either by a bag of soil or a bag of compost at your local nursery or big box store, and just replace the sand with some good organic soil. And realizing that it will break down, it will need to be replenished. You'll see a tremendous difference. The pictures that I showed you of my plot, I have about 10 to 12 inches of compost. I add 2 to 3 to 4 inches every year. And it basically raise up a little bit. And at some point, you're just planting in good compost. Okay, next topic is fertilization. Depending on your soil quality, additional fertilization may be needed. Most compost, and it depends on where you're getting the compost. If you're making your own compost, you really don't know the nutrient level in the compost. If you're buying compost, it may say it on the bag. From the research that I've done, most compost typically has about, and this is something you, if you're not familiar with, you want to get a little comfortable with. The 3 major elements, we call them macronutrients, that all plants need, tomatoes included, is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And most compost has about 1% of each of these. There are exceptions. Worm compost may be higher, but you really need to bring the level of those 3 elements up to about 6%. Whether you do that organically or chemically, about a 6:6 ratio is what the plant would need to really grow well. And more nitrogen isn't always better, because an imbalance of any of these 3, you may create more growth, you may get less fruit, you may induce other problems in the plant. So you don't want to go much beyond 1-1-1 in terms of the, basically equal parts of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. There are fertilizers that have more phosphorus. Florida soils are supposed to be rich in phosphorus. Since I have about 10 to 12 inches of compost, I've actually bought some phosphorus 0-10-0 and diluted it to where I would get about 6% and added it to the fertilizer I'm already using, which has 3% nitrogen and 7% potassium. You also need micronutrients, and they're very important: iron, magnesium, boron, and especially calcium. Soil may contain enough of these, but if you're not sure, you can either have your soil tested, or you can actually, they sell micronutrients. They'll come in a bag just like fertilizer will. With tomatoes, if there's not enough calcium, it's not a disease. It's really a physiological problem, but the blossom end, the bottom of the tomato, they all start to turn brown and rot, and that's really caused by a calcium deficiency. They sell calcium to add to the soil. You have to be careful, follow the label. You can also buy a product called dolomite, which adds calcium but doesn't raise the pH. Lime also contains calcium, but it tends to raise the pH, so I wouldn't recommend using lime in Florida. And follow the label. Always follow the label. use the manufacturer's recommended rate. And if you're really growing a good, healthy tomato and it's really big, it's consuming nutrients. It will deplete the soil of nutrients. So just fertilizing at the beginning of the season really usually isn't enough to keep that plant producing a high yield of fruit. So what I do, and what I would recommend, it's called side dressing. Every 6 to 8 weeks, and away from the base of the plant, about 6 to 8 inches, at a much lighter rate than you would use normal fertilization, maybe half the rate. Just sprinkle a ring of fertilizer around the base, scratch it into the soil, and that really makes a difference. Okay, this chart's a busy chart, but what's shown on the top of the chart is the pH. And that's really, pH is a measure of whether something is acidic, like vinegar, or basic, like bleach. And most soils range from about, they could range from 5 to 8. Like I said, here where we are in Southwest Florida, we're around 7, a little higher maybe. But where you see the red arrow there, if you look at iron and manganese, and they're both very important for the plant, you'll notice at about 7.5, and this is no matter how much iron you put in the soil, if the pH is too high, the plant's not capable of taking up the iron or the manganese. So this is why it's important to check your pH, and if it is too high, then you will have to add more of these elements.
So Arnie, while you're on the most recent slides, we did have some questions coming in, and I just wanted to see if we can get a little clarity on the off chance that, on the chance that some folks are wondering this and have the same questions as what are in the chat. So, someone was asking, when you mention like a foot of space or a foot of soil, are you like encouraging or saying that tomatoes that you can plant them in only a foot of space, or that's the minimum of the amount of soil that they need? Can you clarify?
Yeah, they don't need any more. The roots will extend beyond that if you plant them in a box, obviously. About a cubic foot, a foot and a half is big enough to grow a tomato plant in a pot or a box.
So it's not bad if you have more space, but you'd want to have at least that much if you're wanting to have a happy tomato.
Right. If you want to get the proper root ball to plant size, you're not going to get a big plant with a small root ball.
No, for that space, because of like foliage and sunlight and everything like that, if going in that smaller space, is it even more important to have that tomato plant going up, or that's just what they need for the roots, but allow more space for the plant itself, if not staking it up?
It's really how much space you need for the root to get the amount of leaves on the plant. So it's the balance between, all the nutrients are taken up through the roots. The water is taken up through the roots. So if you have an undersized root system, you're going to have an undersized plant.
Okay, so that led to another question. Someone was asking if they were growing in like a 5-gallon pot or like a self-watering container. For like a self-watering container, can they use potting soil? And then if they're using fertilizer, should they do it through the water or some other way?
Potting soil might be a little too heavy. I would lighten up the potting soil with some peat moss, or a
Or
little
coconut core or.
right, or a little vermiculite or coconut core, just something to allow the roots to penetrate the soil better. Potting soil can tend to get packed down.
Okay.
So you really want a very loose soil. And in fact, those pictures from professional growers, the reason they use the soil mix, and if you've ever started transplants yourself, or even the transplants you buy in the store, you'll see they're all grown in soilless mix. And if you've ever taken, when you remove the pot, you can see how well the roots have penetrated the entire soilless area in that pot. So it makes it much easier for the roots to grow.
Okay.
Potting soil is a little on the heavy side.
Okay.
You can use it, but I would lighten it up by adding some organic material to it.
Okay, and then a couple more quick questions as far as folks are like when talking about things like calcium, etc. So there's a couple on that topic. Some folks are wondering about eggshells. Should they ground it with vinegar water? If they were going to want to use eggshells, how would they go about that? You have thoughts?
I wouldn't use vinegar water because vinegar can really severely damage a plant just because it's very acidic. So I don't think I would use vinegar anywhere near the plant.
Okay.
I would just, if you want to use eggshells, just grind them up.
Okay. And then you mentioned about side dressing. How much side dressing per plant, and does that matter depending on what they're using? Would it say it on the label?
No, but if you look at a label, they tend to give you so many pounds per, maybe 100 square feet or 10 square feet. So you want to reduce that. One plant is maybe 2 or 3 square feet. Okay, underneath where you're doing that side dressing, the root is expanded out maybe 6 to 12 inches in every direction, maybe a little more. So you reduce it by the square footage
Okay.
that you think the root is. So it's typically half or less than you would normally fertilize. And when you fertilize a bed, you're not putting fertilizer in the hole, which really isn't a good idea. It's actually a bad idea. So when you fertilize a bed, you want to fertilize the whole bed so that you have uniform nutrition and the roots will grow out in all directions and get the nutrients. And it's the same thing with side dressing. So you're only side dressing one plant. So whatever you use for 4 or 5 plants, whatever you use for your tomato bed, reduce it by that amount since you're only doing one plant.
Okay. And so folks were about, would you say, Arnie, about halfway through the slides? So I'm going to pause on the questions until we get further through the presentation, because usually Arnie's pretty gracious and he'll stay a little bit later to answer some questions. So go ahead, Arnie, with more of the slides, please.
Okay. Now we get into actual planting. As I mentioned earlier, someone asked the question, you'd like to have a transplant of about 1 foot. And if you are starting it from seed, it takes about 6 to 8 weeks to go from seed to about a 1 foot transplant. Tomato plant's a very unique plant in that you can bury a portion of the stem, and you should bury a portion of the stem. Any part of the stem that comes in contact with the soil will start to produce roots. So typically you want to bury about 1/4 to 1/3 of the stem. And the roots will form on the entire buried stem. When they field plant tomatoes, they actually just dig a trench, lay them in there horizontally, cover them up so only the top 3 or 4 leaves are exposed. And you can grow a tomato like that if you really don't have the depth of good soil. But when you bury the stem, keep in mind, if you're digging below where you have the good soil, and that's where you're putting your root ball, that's not a good place. So you bury the stem as long as the bottom of the root ball is still in good soil. That would be the only caveat for that. The second thing of good practice in planting is plant multiple varieties. It's the same argument in a landscape for not having a monoculture. If you plant a single variety and it gets infested by caterpillars or it gets hit by a certain disease, they're all going to get wiped out the same way. So, for example, I always plant small and large fruited varieties. There have been years here in Florida where I haven't got a single large tomato. Caterpillar got into every tomato. And they avoid the small fruited varieties. So I typically plant a small fruited variety, a full fruited variety, and usually some kind of experimental disease variety. So I usually have 3 varieties. I only have 6 plants, but 3 different varieties. So that tends to really increase your chance of success by planting multiple varieties. And if you're planting indeterminate plants, you really want to stake them immediately. Stems of tomatoes, you learn this the hard way, as I do. They're very soft. The wind can snap them. You can snap them. And if they're indeterminate, you really want to space them about 2.5 feet apart. It really looks lonely when you space them that far apart. But, plant some lettuce in between them or something that'll grow fast. And that you'll be done with before the tomatoes fill the space. They will fill the space. If you're using mulch, always use new mulch. The old mulch may contain disease spores. Mulch conserves water, helps maintain moisture levels in soil. And these are things that the professional growers count on, even moisture. Those first 2 pictures I showed you, when we started, constant moisture levels. So the best way for you to achieve that is to put down a layer of mulch. It also suppresses fungal spores that may reside on the soil surface. Another common mistake is you need to allow for shading. If you're going to grow the plants vertically, and even if you don't, they'll get up there 4, 6, 8 feet on their own, and they may collapse. But they'll start to shade anything that's behind them. So you want to try to plant them on the north side of your plot, if that's possible. And you want to keep them uniformly moist for at least a week after transplanting, just in case there's any transplanting shock. Again, I can't emphasize the benefits of mulching. Here's a statistic. It reduces your watering by 75%. Because 75% of your water loss is due to evaporation. So if you're planting on bare soil, most of it comes out. It just means you have to water more. Water is a precious commodity, certainly here in Florida, probably everywhere. And the mulching just almost eliminates the evaporation. The one I'll get to it in a couple of sentences. It really reduces the weeds. Any weed you have growing is competition for your plant. It's going to feed off the nutrition, it's going to feed off the water, and it can be a host for diseases and insects. The mulch regulates the soil temperature. That's another thing that professional growers do. They maintain constant soil temperature 24/7. So the mulch helps you do a better job of that. You can't do anything about the weather, but the mulch will get the soil, prevent the soil from getting too hot on hot days and getting too cool on cool days. And of course, it looks nice. And then there's the disease control. Some people just sprinkle mulch. I mean, it's like, really sprinkle it. So it's like a 1/2 inch. You really want to build up to a thickness of 3 or 4 inches. Don't cover an 8-inch transplant with 4 inches of mulch. Start with a 1/2 to 1 inch, and as the plant grows bigger, add more mulch. But basically, once that plant gets to be, say, 2 or 3 feet tall, you really want to have 3 or 4 inches of mulch. And you want to leave a few inches of bare soil right at the stem where it goes into the soil at the base of the plant to avoid any disease. Straw seems to be the most popular. Coastal straw, pine straw. Try to avoid nugget mulch. It compacts too much. It tends to wash away. Straw is a much better choice. Okay, watering. You don't want your soil wet all the time. You want it to be damp. Don't water just because you came out to the garden, you picked up the hose. Check the soil. All right, and I just put my finger in the soil. If you don't want to do that, go out with a little fork or a spoon. If it's moist in the first couple of inches, you don't need to water. Make sure you water the soil not wet. When you wet the leaves, you're just allowing disease to spread. It needs moisture on the leaves to start to grow, a little wind to spread it. So try to avoid watering late afternoon if possible. And if you are not training your tomato and it does form this umbrella shape, it's like watering an umbrella, all right? The water is going to run off the sides and not much of it is going to get to the root. So if you have an umbrella-shaped tomato plant, you got to kind of snake the hose inside that umbrella down to the soil level where the roots are. Watering below the roots is optimal. Again, that's what the professionals growers do. So how can you do that in a plot? Well, when I had a garden at my home, what I would do in my tomato beds, and actually all my beds, and I had fixed beds, I would dig a trench on the edge of the bed, 6 to 8 inches deep, all around the bed. I would bury a soaker hose. You cap one end and you bring the other end that connects to the garden hose above the soil. And then I would only water my plants once a week for 3 or 4 hours. It's a drip system. I never had a drop of water on a leaf. We can't do that in community gardens, but this is something, if you're growing at your home, this is a way to really replicate what the professional growers do. Because what you're doing is you're forcing the roots to reach down for the water. So they will grow long, they will spread out, and you'll basically get a bigger root ball. Okay, so now how do we grow them? And there's going to be a lot of pictures here, so hopefully this will go a little faster. If you're growing a determinate variety, minimum of 6 hours of sun. If you only have 6 hours of sun, you're going to get reduced fruit production and a reduced plant size. This is a plant that likes full sun. 10 hours or more would be best. But the determined variety, as I mentioned earlier, it's a good choice for a pot or a raised bed. Little or no staking, minimal maintenance. It's good for a weekend gardener. Indeterminate varieties, now we're into training the plant. And I will show you different styles in the next couple of charts. Same deal on the sun, at least 6 hours of sun, 10 hours or more is best. A healthy plant will outgrow the tomato cage and form an umbrella shape. And if that plant really has everything it needs, in 4 weeks, it'll be over the top of the cage. And again, tomatoes, you can grow them any way you want, vertically, horizontally, espalier like a grape. And you can get heights of 10 to 15 feet. And I'll show you a couple of pictures a little later. And now we get to prune or not to prune. Tomato plants, when they grow, off the stem will come, the common term is suckers, but they're really growth buds. And then you'll get a new section off the plant. Pruning increases fruit size, gives you better control of the plant. It does improve airflow. It's generally recommended, but I don't follow it. It's been my experience that by not pruning, and of course there's a price, I end up getting basically more pounds of tomato. And the principle is very simple. By not pruning, I'm producing more leaves, the plant's producing more leaves. The more leaves, the more photosynthesis. The more photosynthesis, the more growth, the bigger the plant gets. Bigger the plant gets, the more flowers, the more tomatoes. And the bigger the plant gets, and this is where the training comes in, when you study the way the disease progresses on the plant, the further away from the base of the plant, which is really where most fungal diseases start, you can extend the plant life. The downside is it's way more labor intensive. Those pictures I showed you, I'm spending, I'd say, about 4 hours a week training my tomato plants. And you can support them. There's all kinds of techniques. You can grow vertical. It depends how big your ladder is. You can grow horizontal. That takes a lot of space. You can combine them. Turning, you got to be very careful so you don't break the stems. There are all sorts of structures you can buy: cages, stack cages, fences, trellises. People make up their own things, and I'll show you some pictures. Horizontal, that's an interesting way to grow if you have the room. You don't have to grow them over soil. Only the plant needs to be in soil where the stem and the roots are. The rest of the plant can grow over anything. And you keep in mind that it'll always turn up toward the sun. I use plastic ties. They come in 100-foot rolls, pretty economical, $3 or $4 for a 100-foot roll. And if you're going to create a structure, you need to make sure it won't topple over in the wind. I've had my structures come down a couple of times. 3 or 4 plants with 20 tomatoes on a plant, that can weigh up to about 75 pounds. Those pictures I showed you, and I'll show you a couple more of my structure, I'm probably between 100 and 200 pounds right now of weight. So that's something you really have to plan in advance for. Okay, so I'm going to show you a whole bunch of growing styles. These are all from the community garden. This I call the jungle style. So there's about 6 to 8, maybe 10 tomato plants in there, all probably started on cages and then just left. And they basically, in some cases, they're supporting each other. But to get in there and to get the water to the stems, to find the ripe tomatoes, it's a growing technique, but it certainly has its difficulties. Okay, there's along the ground. So here's the case of a gardener that, and you can see the tomato cage there. And they just let the plant do what it did. It didn't stay in the cage. That section came out, and that's kind of growing along the ground. And actually, there's not much problem with that because it's actually growing on a cement paver path. It may get a little too hot, but the plant will be fine. It'll continue to grow along the ground. You can see it'll grow up, and at some point, its weight will force it down. Some growing out on the other sides. So that's along the ground, low maintenance, no maintenance. And here's more of a traditional tomato cages, and these are large tomato cages. Okay, and these pictures were taken in the middle of November, so those plants are way over the top now. And again, then you got to decide what you're going to do when they go over the top. It's good support. You don't have to do much staking for about a month, but the disease does progress. You can actually, on the bottom, you can see some yellowing leaves. You can see some disease starting on the bottom of these plants. And again, if this particular garden didn't do anything, it will start to form that umbrella shape. And the cages do tip over, and you can notice this gardener actually put in some wooden stakes. So we actually tied the tomato to the stake, but the stake will actually keep the cage from tipping over. This gardener is growing vertically, but now they made a teepee. And you can see that their technique was to grow the tomato up on 3 wooden posts there tied together. I didn't put a picture of what it looks like now, but you can't see the teepee. So basically the tomatoes have totally encompassed it there's really no way to tie them anymore. They're just up to the top of the pole and pretty much on their own. But again, they got the tomatoes up to, that's about 6 feet high or more. And when you do this, you do need to tie the plants more. And the teepee would tend to avoid the toppling because, again, it's supported on 3 sides. So unlikely it would be blown over. The picture on the left, another style of tomato cage. This is just a square red cage. And this is a collapsible cage. It stores flat. Here on the right, you can see someone's actually created, using metal poles, an actual pole trellis, which supports to tie the tomato. Here, the earlier picture I showed you, let me just go back for a second. You see that pole here? Well, this is the same garden. And now what he decided to do is to combine a cage with some wire that's strung and tied onto the post. And now he's going to run the tomato along the post. The one on the right almost looks like a utility pole with utility wires. But again, you have a post. The tomatoes are going to be, you can see the strings. Tomatoes are going to be tied up to the strings. And when they get to the wire, they're going to be tied along the wire. And as long as the post isn't solid, it will support. So that's yet another way. Okay. Picture on the left, back to Epcot again. This is the way Disney grows, not the tree tomatoes, but these are tomatoes where they serve the tomatoes in their restaurants. So again, note the size of the container, maybe 1 cubic feet, and they prune the suckers. So they basically have one main stalk on each plant because the plants are very close. And they have a pulley system with all kinds of supports. Okay, again, back to, this is mine on the right. This is a picture that I took a little earlier so you can see the structure before the tomatoes went over the top. On the right here are the 4 tomatoes I showed you. These 2 off to the side are a disease-resistant variety, and I'll cover the diseases and get to this a little later, but the plant on the left, you can see some of the disease starting on the bottom. That plant is died, and I'll get to what I did with that, with the tomatoes in that plant near the end of the presentation. Okay, so if I summarize just the growing styles, you can grow horizontally in plastic pipes with vertical posts. On the ground is not really recommended, at least not on the soil, because you will get a lot of disease, a lot of rotting. So you really need to keep them off the ground if they're over soil, but they can be grown over hardscape. And the new growth is further away from the main stem, which is really good for disease control. And you can get a 15 to 20 foot plant and it won't topple over. It needs a lot of space, but if you want to grow on a lanai, for example, and you have some room on the south side, on the inside of the lanai, if you have 1 foot or 1.5 feet, you could start in a pot or a grow box and then just train that plant to grow horizontally right across the side of the lanai. You need lots of plant ties. You do need some pruning because the plant's going to spread out in all directions. So if you've got limited space, you're basically pruning just so you can get to the plant or get around the plant. And then there's growing vertical. The only limitation of growing vertical is how big a ladder you want to have. Air circulation is important. It slows the disease progression. The spores that carry the disease, they travel upward from the soil. They get splashed from watering or from rain. Wind will carry them higher. When we get to cooler temperatures, dew on the leaves. Once the leaves get wet with a little wind, it spreads the spores. A vertical, combining a vertical and a horizontal, you can extend the length of the plant without a large ladder. That's its main advantage. And it also allows for other plants under the horizontal section, which is why I chose that method. But it's the most labor intensive, and it really requires some significant support structure. Okay, Mindy, any questions before you get into this? This is really the last big section. I don't think I'm doing
just because we're at 11:23, if it's okay by you, we'll go ahead. And I know a lot of folks have questions about diseases, especially when it comes to tomatoes in Florida. So if folks want to, we can follow up with email if we need to, if folks can't stay on and they asked a question that wasn't answered in the chat, or they can post questions in the chat and we'll stay on after the presentation and answer then, if that's okay.
Okay. So first, control measures. Whatever you do, you want to utilize in conjunction with integrated pest management. And I'll only spend like 30 seconds, and there's a whole course on it if you want to really find out all the details. It basically involves monitoring your plants. Every time I go to my garden, the first thing I do, and I'm going to really limit this to tomatoes, I look at the new growth. That's your best indicator of a real problem. If the new growth looks like it's slowing down, if it's wilting, if there's anything wrong with the new growth, you have a serious problem. And you really want to monitor the whole plant. Look at the bottom of the plant, get under the plant, look for leaves that are yellowing or have spots, or look for anything unusual on the plant. And then decide what to do. Last time I was at the garden, the caterpillars are starting to chew the leaves. I have so many leaves, they can have a ball, no problem. All right, if they start to get into tomatoes, and I see them boring in, then I'll have a different thing. But the decision on holes in the leaves was to do nothing. And then, of course, the next one is intervention. If there's a problem there that needs to be solved, then you can decide what you want to do. Could be cultural. You find a tomato hornworm, hard to see, but once you see it, you know it's there. You pull it off. I don't squish them, they're too big. I cut them into thirds. That's mechanical, cultural, biological. These are all low impact solutions. Chemical should be your last choice. And then last step is evaluation. Did you make a difference? If you sprayed that real nasty chemical and it didn't do anything, well, maybe you shouldn't spray the chemical anymore. So crop rotation, rotate your crops as much as possible within the space you have. The biggest thing you can do to minimize pest and disease damage is by plant selection. Plant a disease-resistant variety, a cherry tomato if you got a lot of caterpillar problems. The label may tell you information. Seed catalogs will give you some information on the plant. Do your own research, and then time your planting to outgrow the damage. Those schedules that I showed you for planting will do just that. If you're planting your tomatoes in the middle of August here in Florida, very few people are planting anything. So the diseases are at a minimum. Insects have not come to life and bothered our plants yet. So it's a good time to start growing. What I've observed, and this is an observation, I don't know that this is science, but blights, which are really, at least here in Southwest Florida, these are the worst diseases, the most common diseases that hit our plants. They don't really start until mid to late November. You get a combination of cooler nights, morning dew on the leaves, some gentle winds. Once the spores, which are everywhere, once they become active, once they get on a leaf, they start to grow, feed on the leaf and propagate, and it's off to the races with the diseases. So again, planting in late August is probably the best time to plant, and again in late January if you protect from frost. So here's a list, and this is why people have problems with tomatoes. It probably has the longest list of tomato diseases, that a plant can have. And they classify the resistance to these diseases as high resistance, intermediate resistance, and tolerant. And you obviously would like to get high resistance, and you got to take the recommendations that you get from the seed producer with a grain of salt. Use your own experience growing the plant. Two types of wilts, verticillium wilt and fusarium wilt. I'll show you pictures of these. The plant will wilt during the day, recovers at night. It occurs when the temperatures get cooler, and you're not going to get rid of the spores. They'll last for 6 years in the soil. Nematodes, this is a big problem in Florida. It's not really a disease. It's a microscopic worm that feeds on the root. You may see wilting, you may see a stunted plant. Sometimes you don't see anything. There's tobacco mosaic virus, alternaria stem canker, Stemphilium gray leaf spot, tomato spotted wilt virus, bacterial spot. The ones that I've highlighted in red, the nematodes, early blight, late blight, and tomato yellow leaf curl virus, these are the 5 that I've personally experienced. They're fairly common in our area. Septoria leaf spot, for some reason, they never gave it a cute little alphabet name, but it is a fairly common disease. Okay, so the wilts, it's a winter disease in Florida. It thrives in 60 to 70-degree days. The lower leaves may show a V-shaped lesion. Blights are the most common. Early blight being the most common, late blight, much less common. The spores are spread by anything, wind, rain, watering, either on your clothes or on your hands or on your tools. And I'll show you pictures of these. Again, by scouting and spotting these diseases early, this is the best way to catch them and possibly some control. Early blight starts as yellow blotches, then it goes to small brown circles. It's very contagious, may be fatal. I've never seen a tomato plant that didn't have early blight. Late blight is much less common. It looks very different. I'll show you the pictures. It's got gray purple blotches, very contagious, fatal to the plant. And this is one disease where if you see this disease, you pull a plant. Because if it spreads commercially, it can really impact tomato production in Florida. Septoria leaf spot, very destructive. It looks very different when it starts out. There's no yellowing, it's just small brown little, about 1/16 of an inch circles. Same as the early blight and late blight. The spores are in the soil surface. They can exist on cages and stakes. The spores can survive a couple of years. Preventative fungicides can slow the disease. And this is the only thing I ever put on my plants. There's an organic copper soap, and I only use it when the plants are small. I think it alters the pH a little bit on the leaf, and it makes it inhospitable for the spores for a while. So my only goal here is to get the plant big enough so it'll outgrow the spores. There are other fungicides. Some of them are very lethal. So read the label, be very careful about putting any fungicide on your plant, and follow the directions. Okay, sorry. Bacterial diseases, I've never seen any here. Bacterial spot looks like Septoria spot. You got to put them under a microscope. Plant scientists can tell the difference, but Septoria spot is really the most common one. And then the viral diseases. This is a pretty bad disease here in Florida. Tomato yellow leaf curl virus. Viral diseases need need a host to carry them around, meaning an insect. They're not a spore. And they affect the southern half of the United States, mainly Florida. The new growth will turn a greenish yellow, and the leaves tend to become crunchy. They curl upward, and it's fatal to the plant. It can only be spread by an insect called silverleaf whitefly. Can't be spread from plant to plant by wind or rain. You can't spread it. Only the whitefly. The only control that exists are disease-resistant variety. We're trying to control the whitefly population, if possible. Scouting for whiteflies, pulling spent veggies like beans to reduce the shelter that the whitefly has. Insect pests, caterpillars are probably the most common insect pest that affects tomato plants. There's a hornworm caterpillar, armyworm, pinworm, pickleworm. And the biggest damage that they really do is burrowing into the fruit. If you've got a healthy tomato plant with a large amount of leaf growth, rare that these caterpillars can ever do anything that would really reduce the photosynthesis and really reduce the leaf population. I've never seen any damage from a caterpillar on a leaf that was worth doing anything about. But there's a very safe product. BT is called Bacillus thuringiensis. The trade name you may see it under is Thuricide. It's very organic. It's basically it's a biologic, and I actually use it mainly on the tomatoes. I will spray the tomatoes to try to keep the caterpillars from doing any damage. And what it does is it disables their digestive system and they starve to death. And again, small fruited tomatoes, caterpillars don't bother them. We also have aphids and beetles. Don't grow northern potatoes. There's a bad beetle, a Colorado potato beetle. Leaf miners usually don't do anything worth going after. We have our standard animal pests, birds. If they see a nice red tomato, they will peck on it. Squirrels, they'll pick the fruit green and eat it, pick it red. One thing you can do for birds and squirrels, and I'll get to this in my last slide, you can pick the fruit green and ripen them in paper lunch bags. Nematodes I mentioned earlier, it's a microscopic worm that feeds on roots. Rotation helps, resistant varieties, sizable transplants, cover crops, crab meal. There are trap crops, there are nematicides that you can apply. They're very expensive. So here are diseases that are common in our area. At least these are diseases that I've observed. Early blight, this again just a summary on the diseases. Most common, and if it's severe, it'll kill a plant. Septoria leaf spot, fairly common and also can kill a plant. The tomato yellow leaf curl virus is spread by the silverleaf whitefly. Once the plant gets infected, the plant basically freezes. It won't produce any new tomatoes. It won't grow. The tomatoes that are on there just probably won't ripen. And an unaffected whitefly can get infected from a diseased plant. So if you have a diseased plant, if you have a plant that has the virus, an unaffected whitefly feeds on that plant, it can pick up the virus. It infects new growth on the top of the plant, and it spreads through the plant. What I've observed, though, is that whether the whitefly is lazy or it's just easier, it doesn't like to fly too high to get to the top of the plant. So I find when I get my plants up very high, to 6, I've seen this on other plants in our garden, there's very little damage from this disease for tall plants. If you have a plant that's 2 or 3 or 4 feet tall, those are the plants that seem to get most affected by this virus. Late blight, I did observe it once on one of my plants in all the years I've been in Florida, but it is very deadly, so you would pull the plant if you see that. So here's a quick pictorial. Picture on the left. This is the start of early blight. You see the yellowing of the leaf, the brown spot yellowing on this leaf, a little yellowing starting on that leaf. If you look on the picture on the right, it looks very different than the picture on the left. It's sort of like purplish gray, and these patches, you can't tell in the photo, they're sort of like greasy. That's late blight. So it's very easy to distinguish them when they're just starting. When the leaf is already half dead, it's not as easy. Here's the start of septorious spot. If you could see my cursor circling, you see the little brown dots on the leaf, a little brown dot there, a little bit up here. And there's a picture of it right before it destroyed the plant, where it's actually worked its way up. You notice the leaves on the bottom are all gone. They've succumbed to it. So again, they always work their way up to the top of the plant. These are not my pictures. These are University of Florida pictures. Wilt, you usually know when you got wilt because that's what the plant looks like. It almost looks like frost damage. So this would be in the middle of the day. Again, I've never seen it here on a plant in the community gardens. Fusarium wilt on the left, verticillium wilt on the right. This is tomato yellow curl virus. It's very distinctive. The yellowing on the edges of the leaf, the green veins. The leaves are crunchy. Remember, crunchy leaves you'll find on determinate tomato plants. Indeterminate tomato plants have a very open, soft textured leaf. When an indeterminate plant, the leaf starts to look like this and curl up, it's got tomato yellow leaf curl. This is actually one of my plants. Plant grew great. There was way more root system than that. See these ugly looking nodules? These are nematodes that crawled inside the root, fed off the roots, and created those nodules. I didn't know I had a problem until I pulled the plant. So the plant had enough root to survive it. So this is a case of, if your plant is healthy, there's nothing you need to do. And you really don't know you got nematode damage until you dig up the roots. So at the end of the season, if you see this, or sometimes it will get into a plant when it's young, and then you will see signs. The plant will be anemic, it won't be growing, it may start to wilt. And again, you'll see this type of damage on the plant. Okay, here's just a partial list of some disease-resistant varieties. Early blight, Iron Lady, I would call it low resistance. I've grown it. Mountain Magic, Juliet is a grape that I grow. Defiant and Plum Regal, I think those are both determinants. For late blight, Mountain Magic, Iron Lady again, Defiant. Brandywise, that was a tomato I showed you where one of the plants had died. Black Crim, Black Plum, Septorious Spot, Cornell University, last 5 or 6 years has developed varieties that are very highly resistant to Septorious Spot. It just doesn't get it. It's almost like the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines that we're getting around the country. You just don't get it. You don't get the disease. So these are really resistant to the point where there is none. The problem is they do get early blight, and I did lose one of them to early blight. For slicing, Iron Lady, Stellar, Brandywise. Brandywise is actually a real nice tomato. What they did is they took the Heirloom brandy wine and crossed it with a tomato that had the gene that was very resistant to Sartorius spot. It's a very good tasting tomato. Iron Lady is not a very good tasting tomato. It's kind of store-like. It doesn't have that nice, ripe tomato taste. Campari, that's a salad tomato. I'm going to try that this summer. There's a plum. It's a determinant. But again, you would only get these varieties if you have a problem with Sartorius spot. For tomato yellow curl virus, Charger, Champion 2, Red Eclipse. And I've never tried any of them, so I don't know whether the resistance is strong or weak. It's something you just have to experiment with. Okay, plant selection matters. This is Iron Lady. That's the first septoria-resistant plant I tried. And you can see the yellowing, which is early blight. You can't see it in the picture. There is no septoria spot here. These two I showed you earlier, these are Brandywise. This one, the one on the left, has died from septoria spot. The one on the right is still going strong. It's over the top. It's going in all directions. Okay, quickly, some alternatives to in-ground plot planting. Raised bed gardening. Even in an in-ground plot, a lot of our plot owners are choosing to raise the bed in a standard plot and just putting compost in there. A structure can be anything that's food safe and non-toxic, that'll hold soil. You want to be 12 to 18 inches deep for tomatoes. Don't use older pressure treated wood. Advantage is you're planting above the soil problem. You're planting above the sand. You're planting above the nematodes, the fungal spores for a while. They will eventually work their way up. And you can optimize the soil structure, type of soil, the pH. You may need a little more watering. Individual pots, at least 12 inches wide and deep. Soilless mixtures really are best for growing tomatoes in pots. And determined varieties are the best variety for a pot because you don't have to deal with the staking. Indeterminate varieties can be grown in pots, but you haven't avoided what to do with the plant when it gets big. You need to fertilize these on a regular basis, and you need micronutrients, especially if you're planting in a soilless mix. You can work, again, you got to dilute it to the right strength. You're planting in a pot. A granular fertilizer, you need to work that in, and again, reduce it to the fact that you're only planting in about a cubic foot of soil. Self-contained gardening systems. This is really good for a lazy gardener. You can plant it and forget it. It's a very unique growing system, and it's going to really mimic what the professional growers do. There's self-contained growing systems such as Earthbox, City Pickers, or you can build your own. They all use and require soilless mix. Slow release fertilizer is combined with continuous bottom moisture release as a reservoir, and the water wicks up so the roots go down. The growth rate can approach 2 to 3 inches a day. Very high water requirements when the plants are large. There is an automatic waterer. I find it very useful because I make lots of trips to New York. Plastic covers reduce the incidence of the fungal spores. You would typically only put 2 tomatoes in a box. So here's 2 of mine. This one was from a couple of years ago. All right, this was Iron Lady, and this is really a semi-determinate. This is a backup Brandywise that I grew. And again, where you see the plant, this is 1123. It was another 4 feet high, almost to the top of my lanai cage. So I needed an 8-foot ladder to work on this one. So again, when you grow in one of these boxes and you're growing an indeterminate, just keep in mind that you haven't solved the fact that the plant wants to grow in all directions. Okay, last chart. The plant that Brandywise, that I pulled from my garden plot about 2 weeks ago, there were about 50 tomatoes that were full to half size, that were anywhere from green to pink to maybe 4 or 5 days away from ripening, but the plant was dead. So I picked all the 50 tomatoes, put them in paper bags, and you can extend your gardening season. So at the end of the season, you pulled your plant, the plant died, it's too hot, you've got all these green tomatoes. So here's ordinary paper bag, lunch paper bag, picture below, and I just point this was a totally green tomato. This picture is taken about 10 days from full green. It had another, and when I took it, it's now totally ripe. It's in the refrigerator. It's totally ripe. In another 7 days or so, it's fully ripened. So you can take any blemish-free fruit, any size. You don't want them too small. Any stage of ripening from green to almost ripe. Can take anywhere from a few days to a full week, a few weeks. You check it every few days, and 75 to 80% will ripen successfully. And they taste much better than store-bought. When you put them in the bag, the tomatoes emit a chemical called ethylene, naturally, that aids in the ripening process. So when you put them in the bag, you're not pumping in the ethylene. It's coming from the tomato. They ripen very slowly, and they taste pretty good. There are some references, some more references. I even have one here on taste somewhere. All right, so you can see where it is. This is an interesting one. Can soil fertility improve tomato taste? It was from Rutgers University, New Jersey, and of course, anyone from New Jersey believes, and they do they grow an excellent tomato, that they're the best tasting tomato in the United States, sort of like Chicago pizza. But it's an interesting article on what affects tomato taste. And there's a whole bunch on nematodes. So we'll take any questions that you might have. I apologize for not too bad, but going over.
Thank you, Arnie. So we do have questions, and you had, and just as a segue, somebody did, because you just talked about taste a little bit. Someone had asked if there's a difference in taste, whether you're growing like in like a greenhouse type setting, or outdoors. Does that impact flavor?
I don't think that does, but after reading the article on soil and taste, and it's a subjective thing, it was an interesting article. The soil, the writers concluded that the soil does affect the taste. And I personally think pH has an effect on taste, because I know that my tomatoes, same variety that I grow in New York, and I grow the same variety in Florida, they're a little more acidic tasting in New York, because my soil in New York is way more acidic. It's probably around 6. Or maybe even a little lower, whereas here in Florida it's around 7. So I think the soil would affect the taste, but I don't think whether you grow it in a greenhouse, if it's ripened naturally, it should taste the same, all other things being equal, would be my answer.
Okay. So someone had asked, can you talk a little bit about plant ties? If somebody is training their tomato plants or just wanting to secure them a little bit better, what do you use? Have you seen other gardeners use something different, and pros and cons?
Yeah, I have seen people use string. I don't recommend that. What you really want to do when you tie a plant, you don't want to strangle a stem. Okay, if you tie it to, remember, you're tying probably a stem that's going to get twice as thick. So I use the plastic ties, and it's more convenient to use on a roll, and I just cut the length I need with a scissor. They come in strips also. So I tie them not tightly. I would leave about enough space for the stem to get about twice or three times as thick. You just want to secure them and hold them in place, and twist them just like you would twist. If you had opened the bread and you tied it with a plastic tie, it's not in. You want to tie it just to hold it in place, but not tightly.
Okay. And even now there's things of like Velcro and stuff like that where you could, it's like a soft Velcro for plant securing. I just started trying that. I don't have an opinion yet.
I don't know. The only thing I can tell you is the stems are incredibly delicate.
Okay.
It's very hard for me to tie my plants without accidentally breaking off a stem if my elbow or the back of my hand hits it as I'm tying something else. And they really need to be treated very, very, very gingerly when you tie them, especially when you're tying the end of the growth off.
Okay.
And
to that end, talking about tying things and breaking things off, someone had asked, when it comes to pruning, like if their tomato plant is blooming at a young stage, and they think it might be on the young side, is it beneficial to take those blooms off or to take that piece off? Or
I would, if it's blooming early, that's not a good sign. It
Okay.
could be that the plant was pot bound.
Okay.
If the person bought the plant, but they would have seen that when they took it out of the pot. It could have been deprived of water if they bought it. If the plant's deprived of water, it wants to reproduce. It's going to put out flowers. Growers do that when they sell you annuals. They'll deprive them of water to force the plant to flower. So if it's an indeterminate plant and it's only a foot or two high and it's making flowers, probably cut them off. And just grow the plant naturally. Don't over fertilize it. Don't overwater it. Give it a chance to recover. Let the root system, support the plant, and it should get to normal growth. I don't get flowers on my plants until they're at least 5 feet tall or more. You don't see the first flowers. And again, cherries and grapes will tend to put out the flowers earlier. The earlier varieties will. So it depends on what the person was growing. An earlier variety would be earlier, a determinate even earlier.
So labeling our plants when they look the same is kind of important.
Yeah.
And so then also there's questions about pollination. So if somebody was growing a tomato indoor or away from other tomato plants, do they need to have pollinators? And sorry, Arnie, and I do want to ask you, is it okay to keep you a little bit longer for some questions, or do you need?
Yes, no, it's okay. My wife was just bringing the phone in.
Okay. So when it comes to tomatoes, do you need to have bees for pollination, or?
No, they could help. Actually, the moths that lay the caterpillars eggs on the plants, they'll do some pollination. But tomatoes are pretty much self-pollinating. The male and female parts are in each flower has them. It doesn't take much of a gentle wind for them to pollinate. I suspect that most pollination is done by the wind. There are flies that'll do that. Like I said, moths, which produce most of the bad caterpillars. Bees, I don't see many bees around. I don't see many bees, period, actually, in the community garden, unfortunately. But no, bees are not needed. They're certainly welcome, but not needed.
So, and then when it comes to, this kind of goes to if you're growing in a pot, and it kind of goes back to pruning a little bit. If somebody was trying to keep their tomato plant on the smaller side, can they prune it? And is that going to make larger tomatoes? In other words,
yes and yes.
Okay, good.
You can certainly prune it. If in other words, you can prune it to be the plant you want. In other words, if you want it to be 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, you can certainly do that.
Okay,
It
but if it
takes,
was like a determinate and you come through and you take off a bunch of branches and a bunch of blooms, you still have a window of time for production?
I would be careful about determinants because they produce all their tomatoes at once.
Okay.
So what that plant will do is, again, it's got a limited lifespan, much shorter than the indeterminate. So once they start producing their flowers, they're pretty much going to make all their flowers at the same time. So I'm not sure it's advantageous, certainly not to prune off the flowers to get bigger fruit. You could if you wanted to, but given that you're only going to get tomatoes over 2 or 3 weeks, it really depends on what you plan to do with the tomatoes. There's probably going to be more tomatoes than you can eat in 2 or 3 weeks, but if you want to make a sauce and keep it in the refrigerator, you could do that. So it really depends on the use of the tomato.
That makes sense. And then somebody asked, is it worth shading tomatoes if they're hoping to extend the tomato plant into the summer heat? In other words, like I'm thinking maybe they mean like a tomato plant where it's like a bigger tomato, like a beefsteak or something like that. Is the sun going to impact it, or?
You can, there are structures called shade covers that you can buy. And what they recommend for vegetable plants, this would, you really be using these like in June, maybe into July. They cut down the intensity of the sun by about 40%. And that's still in the summer sun, that would be enough sun for a tomato plant. More importantly, they reduce the temperature about 10 degrees. And it might make a difference. I've never seen anyone use it on a tomato plant only because they're so big. So that's a lot of shade cover.
So,
In theory, yeah, you could do that, and it might work.
okay.
It wouldn't be a cure-all. I doubt that it would work through the entire summer, but you might get an extra 3 or 4 weeks
Okay.
out of a tomato plant.
And someone asked if they have tomato plants that they started from seeds and they're now about 4 to 5 inches tall, but the leaves are turning pale yellow to white. They're keeping it watered and they're outside during the day. They're in that Tallahassee area and they're having temperatures about 65 to 70 degrees during the day. Any ideas on what's going on? They have 3 different varieties and it seems like it's happening on all 3.
That's ideal temperatures, so they're not, unless there was really, we've had some cool nights, though. So the question, if you could get the person to answer, what did they do with the plants when the temperatures were going to go down into the 30s?
I think they're bringing it in if it's at night, because it just said that they're outside during the day.
Okay.
So yeah, leaves turning a pale yellow to white.
Pale yellow by itself would indicate a nutritional deficiency, like nitrogen. White, that could be fungus. They could be getting too wet. It could be overwatering. And that would also make the leaves yellow, by the way.
Because you're leaching out your nutrient?
Overwatering and under-fertilizing both would make the leaves yellow. And overwatering, they could be inducing some fungus onto the leaves.
Okay. So, and when in doubt, take some pictures. You're welcome to email it to me, or you might want to engage your local extension office. Their plant clinic may be receiving emails and photos and be able to answer questions too. And then ideal soil temperature to plant out tomatoes.
Ideal soil temperature is about, well, minimum would be about 50 degrees. And we're above that here in Central Florida now. We're probably closer to 60. 60 is fine. It's perfect temperature in Central Florida to plant the tomatoes. Because the soil temperatures are really going to move. They're going to start to move up even higher as we get into March. But we're probably in the 60s now. That's right where you want it to be if you perfect soil temperature, and with temperatures now during the day, perfect.
Okay. And then we did have questions when you were talking about blossom end rot and calcium and nutrition and things of that nature. We were getting a few different questions. Can you give a little bit more information when it comes to blossom end rot, whether it's to avoid it or to, if you notice it, when would you notice it, and can you apply some sort of method or nutritional? Because people were asking about eggshells, but then they're also asking about what else you could use for like a calcium supplement, that type of thing, and is it impacted at all by watering and things like that?
Okay. If you notice it, the tomatoes that have it, they're toast. All right, they're rotted. But you can prevent future tomatoes from getting it by introducing the calcium. The safest way actually is with dolomite. It doesn't do anything to the soil except add calcium. You can buy it in bags. They're in the nurseries. That would be the easiest. You can buy calcium in a bag. Just want to be very careful, especially if you're putting it in a pot. But I think as a general additive, I would use dolomite. It's what I use in my earth boxes. When you put the earth box together, you mix in a small package of dolomite for just that purpose into the soilless mix to add the calcium. And you don't get, and it works fine. And you can really add it anytime. So if you have the disorder, and you're still growing the plant, just work it into the soil. Like I said, you can't it's not a fertilizer. It's not going to over fertilize the plant. It's dilute enough that you can just literally work it just like a side dressing. You just want to get it in a little deeper, so it gets down to the roots a little quicker than the fertilizer would. Okay. But that should do the trick.
Okay. A couple of questions came in that Arnie addressed in the slides about planting tomatoes deeper. And yes, you do want to plant your tomatoes deeper. And then there was, someone had asked that it looks like something has been disturbing their tomato leaves. And I don't know if we can answer this without a picture. They said it doesn't look like leaf miner, but it almost makes the leaves, the top leaves look lacy, if you will. And I don't know if they mean that by like a webbing of the leaf, or if they mean that it makes it frilly.
Yeah, there are insects that will actually shred a leaf.
Okay.
So if by lacy they mean the leaf is kind of shredding.
Yeah, so I don't know. Yeah, if you can you elaborate more in the comments? It says all of the leaf gets eaten except the veins.
Yeah, that is definitely an insect. I don't know which insect.
Yeah, that would be, if you can, I would explore, like do a little scouting at different times of day, and definitely include, all the parts of the foliage on the plant, and then also look around in the soil and neighboring plants to see if you can identify something that you haven't seen before. And if you see something else, then you're wondering if that's what it is, definitely take pictures of an insect if you encounter it. But otherwise, if you can take pictures of the foliage that has the damage, that would be great, that you can send to our office. You can either email our plant clinic, or you can email me, and I will route it. So, and then people are asking if you can use potting soil or garden soil in grow bags.
No. The reason being is the uptake of water really requires a very, very light mix, because it's almost like it's a wicking effect. So there's a reservoir on the bottom, and potting soil is, in fact, if you read the directions, one of the links there is actually, it's a really good link from Earthbox on how to grow. It's in their box, but it's basically very general information on how to grow in grow boxes. But you definitely want to use a soilless mix. You want that very light, airy mix that's like a sponge, because that's the only way it's going to. If the soil is too heavy, it will never get to, it won't fully permeate the entire earth box. And when you take a tomato plant out of a grow box at the end of the season, the root will have fully permeated the entire box. So we're talking a cubic foot and a half of root and into the reservoir. And it just won't happen with potting soil. It probably will result in a failure.
Okay. If for fall tomatoes that are producing now, is it too late in Sarasota to plant now for an 1 or 2 inch sized plant?
It's not too late, but you really want to plant like now. A little blurb I had there on plant February 26th if you can. Try an early variety so you get more tomatoes. Most of the standard varieties, you'll start to get tomatoes just about when they stop pollinating well. So you get a limited production on a standard variety. Cherries would be good. Any early variety, a grape would be good.
Okay. And somebody had asked earlier, I think about Cherokee Purple, and but it was a holdover from fall, and it sounded like it had produced but was blooming again. And so my assumption, since it's already planted and blooming, may as well keep it and see if they can get harvest off of it, but it wouldn't necessarily be one to go look for.
Absolutely. If it's, as long as the growth is good, the new growth is producing, it should be really producing, starting to produce good new growth now. And if it's a mature plant, along with that new growth, there should be lots of flowers being produced also. No reason to pull it or just keep it going. Keep it going and let it produce tomatoes.
Okay, and I'm just going to try and squeeze in 1 or 2 more. If you had a question that you had put in chat and you don't recall it being answered and you're waiting, please go ahead and type that in now. So someone was asking for a little bit more elaboration on the pruning. If memory serves, you're not a big advocate of pruning per se, but if somebody, you know how like I've seen where like with people are talking about tomatoes, I don't know if you can see my hand, and how they grow. Some say to, if in the V, if you get some growth coming out there, to take that off.
Yeah, that's where the suckers start. They will always be at that node. They'll always start at a leaf node. All right, and that's going to be a new branch if you let it grow.
Okay, so how would you decide if you want to take it off or let it grow? Do you look at the health of the other branches and say, maybe I need this one, or?
Yeah, definitely. You want to decide how many branches you want. Okay. So as you're growing the plant, the more branches, the more robust the plant, of course, and then the more care it's going to require. So it's how you want to grow the plant, how much space you want to give it. So you would remove the new growth depending on if you already had enough branches and you had this forming at a lower leaf, you would pull it out, or you would pinch it off.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm looking to see if anybody is putting in any other questions, mostly just asking if we're recording, and we are. Compliments to you that they had almost given up on growing tomatoes after a 3rd try, but they've been able to harvest many juicy tomatoes. Big thanks to you, Arnie. And then, do you ever use Epsom salts? I hear mixed things from folks that grow tomatoes. Some people love to use some Epsom salts. Some people don't find the need. Does it matter if you're using a balanced fertilizer, you might not need it, or? Yeah,
I wouldn't use Epsom salts only because it wasn't, if you're buying a bag of Epsom salts, it's not designed for plants. It's magnesium. And you would really need to get you don't want to over fertilize any nutrient. You'd be better, and again, magnesium is just one of about 6 or 8 micronutrients that the plant needs. The best way to get micronutrients into the soil, if you have either a soilless mix or your soil is really depleted, is just buy a bag of micronutrients, or even a general fertilizer. Look at the label. A lot of the better ones contain many of the micronutrients, including magnesium. Epsom salts, I think people use Epsom salts in Florida is more for palms. Magnesium is a very important nutrient for palm trees. So everybody buys magnesium in the form of Epsom salts and puts it around their palm trees. I don't know that it's needed in a large percentage, and it's needed, but not any more than any of the other micronutrients, like iron or boron or manganese.
And and I think last but not least, is if people were asking, what are your favorite tomatoes? So I would kind of add, what are your favorite tomatoes to grow? What are your favorite tomatoes to eat? And then how do you enjoy eating tomatoes?
That's a hard question. But
it's a three-part question too. And then we'll sign off for the day.
I go through tomatoes. In other words, every year I try a new variety. Right now, my two standards, I've always grown a beefsteak tomato, as long as I've been growing tomatoes. That's probably for my large tomato. I just like the taste of the tomato. It's a tart tomato. I slice it and just make a cheese and tomato sandwich out of it. It makes good sauce. So the beefsteak would be my favorite tomato. But I've grown plenty of slicers, the traditional ones. And I'll always grow a small tomato. I've migrated from cherries to grapes. And then in grapes, I've switched to a variety called Juliet. It's really a super grape. It's twice as big as a traditional grape. It's about 2 inches long. And some people call it a mini plum. It's a weed. They describe it as it's a weed. It's the first tomato that produces, and it's the last tomato to give up. I typically get about 500 grape tomatoes off one plant.
Is that New York or Florida?
Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. So again, and I make a lot of sauce. 90%, I can't eat all the tomatoes, so 90% of them get jarred. So I enjoy tomatoes one way or another 12 months a year. So that would be, and then the third one I'm growing now, and I'm going to try a fourth one, is the Brandywise, only because a Brandywine is a very good tasting tomato. And I have to say, Brandywise, and my younger daughter is really into Heirloom, so she's the ultimate judge, and it passed her taste test. It's a pretty good, it really is very close to Brandywine in taste. It's a very good tasting tomato. It's basically getting an Heirloom with some disease resistance. So right now, I'm going to move on to Campari, though, when I get to New York this summer, and try it again in Florida, again, only because of the disease resistance, and we'll see how good it tastes. So the short answer is I grow always at least 3 varieties. Oh, I've actually, in the beefsteaks, I've actually switched to a variety called Big Beef. It's an all-American winner. It's a very high producer. I'll get like 60, 80 tomatoes off one plant. They're not huge. They tend to look more like slicers than beefsteaks, but it just doesn't quit either. So again, I'm looking for taste and I'm looking for volume, poundage, tonnage of tomatoes.
Thank you. Thanks, Arnie. I appreciate all your time today. I think we answered the bulk of the questions. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone for your time today as well. And I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and see you again in the future. Thank you so much.
Thanks everybody for hanging in there.